hangout, joined by the wonderful Oscar Hazel, as usual, and a special guest tonight, Kyle Krabs. You can find him at NDT Scouting, or I'm sorry, at NFL Draft Tracker. So definitely connect with him while we're doing this, so we can send in some questions. We're going to talk about the Dolphins' Day 3 draft and kind of recap the whole thing, as this is the third episode for us. So let's jump right in. I apologize in advance. I'm kind of dealing with some allergies, but let's jump right in. And Oscar, you want to kind of get us started here?
So I guess we'll ask. So we've kind of gone through what we thought of the first 2 days. So we'll get Kyle's thoughts on what's going on with the first round and second, third round pick. So if you want to start off with, or maybe if you want to introduce kind of your work and how you evaluate, because maybe that's a better way to start off for people that don't know your work, and then you can go and talk about James.
Absolutely. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Kyle Krabs. I'm the founder of NDT Scouting. You can find me on Twitter, as Ian said, at NFL Draft Tracker. My website is ndtscouting.com. And I've developed a bit of a system. I actually was very lucky. I have a colleague who worked for several years as an independent scout, and last year actually got hired by an NFL team. When he got hired last spring, he kind of pulled me off to the side and said, "Hey, I know you're doing your own scouting thing, but I'm not going to need these materials anymore." He had developed a little bit of a in-depth evaluation process, and he actually utilized this and got into good graces with a number of NFL teams. So one of the reasons why I really enjoy this evaluation process is it resonates with a number of teams. This is something that somebody used, I've tinkered with so that it's adequate to my personal beliefs, my personal convictions. But this essential layout is something that, for at least 5 or 6 NFL teams, it's something that they very much can relate to and have an appreciation for in terms of evaluation. My evaluations take place on 5 different levels. I evaluate size based off of NFL prototypes for a specific position. I evaluate experience, which includes starts, whether or not that player was a captain. Obviously, when you look at the Dolphins draft this year, a lot has been made about how many team captains that they drafted. So that's something that some teams do look at. I take a look at production, something that can't really be evaluated with offensive linemen. So that percentage of their evaluation is spread evenly throughout with the other aspects of the evaluation. I also take a look at athleticism. My athleticism is position averages based on the last 10 years' performance at the combine. So I've got a scale for relevant tests for each position. And depending on where any particular player tests, there are allotted points. And as those points add up, you get an overall athleticism score. And most importantly, I grade on talent, which you see on the film. I'd say 60% of any particular player's evaluation is based on talent. Those are the things you see on film. You're evaluating foot speed for offensive linemen, hand technique, kick, slide, and pass protection, lateral movement skills, so on and so forth. So every position has their own particulars that I take a look at. Getting into the first pick, with the Dolphins picking at 19 when they took Juwan James, if he was indeed Dennis Hickey's #1 player on their board, I have to question it just because there were so many other talented players on the board. Maybe they skewed their board to adjust for positional need, which is something that is fairly realistic to expect that they potentially did. But for Dennis Hickey to get up on the podium and say, Juwan James was our best overall player on the board when we were picking at 19, I'm a little skeptical of. I thought it was poor value in the fact that he could have been had later in the draft. Whether you believe Carolina was going to take him at 28, or if you thought, like I did, he wasn't worth a first-round selection, he was only worth a second-round, third-round selection. I had him rated in the high third-round range. So that was a selection that I really was not a fan of, because not only did they take him before he was valued, in my opinion, they didn't trade back. And you see teams that are on the board immediately after the Dolphins that are trading back. There was something to be had there. And I think they left something on the table by just sticking to, we need a right guard or a right tackle, so we're going to take Juwan James right off the bat. So I was a little disappointed to see that happen for the Dolphins, just because there were other players and there were other opportunities for them to address the position later on in the draft. But they definitely made up for it as you get into day two. Jarvis Landry is another guy who's going to come in, and he's kind of like that Green Bay Packers prototype wide receiver in that he runs great routes. He's willing to attack the defense at any level, running any route, coming across the middle. He's got strong hands. And he's another piece of this puzzle that for the Dolphins, when you look at some of the guys that they have, excluding Mike Wallace, because he is a bit of an outlier, you look at Brian Hartline, he's an exceptional route runner, usually fairly reliable with his hands. You look at Brandon Gibson, coming in from the St. Louis Rams last year. Before he got hurt, he was doing an outstanding job working throughout the slot and in the middle of the field. They actually have another guy, Rashard Matthews, who I really, really like. And, I'm sure we'll get into the wide receiver position as a whole later on. He's going to have his hands full making this team now, and that's a shame because he's a pretty darn good football player. So Landry, the value didn't line up exactly with my evaluations, but I also understand that at the combine, he was not 100% with his testing. So I went back and did a bit of an adjustment for him after his pro day. So the number you see as my final evaluation when I'm publishing is not what he was if you're grading on his pro day versus grading on his combine. If I'm grading on his pro day, I had him as a very high third-round value. So based on where they were picking, that value lines up pretty well. And then I thought they knocked the Billy Turner pick out of the ballpark. I had Billy Turner as my 13th overall player. I think he has outstanding upside, outstanding potential. The only question with him is whether or not he could handle anything off the edge. But you're kicking him inside to guard, and he's verbally expressed his desire to play on the inside at guard. I think he moves really well in space as far as getting out onto the second level, his ability to pull. He's extremely physical. He's violent. He's exactly what you're looking for an interior offensive lineman. So I think the Dolphins got one of the best steals of the draft, getting Billy Turner at 67.
Well, it kind of felt like to me that they almost did the opposite of last year, where they kind of went for upside high early on in the draft with raw prospects, and this year they took the solid guys they knew they wanted to have. So Juwan James, I kind of understand it. I had him as a high second rounder. The more I've kind of gone back through my notes, and I probably had him lower in my grades due to the fact he only played right tackle. Whereas I kind of think if he had played left tackle and played in the same way, he would have maybe been thought of as a more highly touted prospect just because of that prestige of that position. But obviously having the freak of tiny, even though he went on not to get drafted, having that kind of raw athletic ability in college when that just size and power wins, it's kind of stupid not to put that out at left tackle. So I can kind of understand why Tennessee did that. But I think that maybe is an interesting kind of thing to look at. I think he's got pretty good lateral agility and maybe not like piston feet, but they're fast enough. My comparison was Michael Ruse, so I think you're not getting kind of like a world-class, not getting a top 10 tackle, but you're getting a 10-year starter. So I think I can understand kind of the feeling that it was a reach, but I also think if they didn't like Moses, which a lot of teams seem to not have, and they kind of had the best intel on him with Laser having worked with him for 3 years, and they didn't want Quandro's injury concerns going forward with they need a day one starter, I can kind of see that theory of like, oh, we need to get a guy now that we know can play, played every game, all at right tackle, so got no question marks. I can understand that with Landry as well. You're getting someone. There's one thing this roster is kind of lacked, and someone that can grab the ball and extend for the ball, clutch it in the air. I think he had a 2.5% drop rate last year via NU Gap, his kind of Roto World metrics, and that's pretty remarkable kind of drop rate. I don't think I don't think I've ever seen a player catch so many things, or not, and he makes spectacular catches as well. It's not just all in bucket or in his body. He grabs it out there. But yeah, I agree with. I think Billy and James were pretty much. I had the same grade for them, but kind of for opposite reasons. Kind of Billy, you're projecting he could be a left tackle at some point, and he just loves to get his hands on guys and throw them on the floor, and that's and has athleticism to get out into space. I think there's one play that, I can't remember, it was ages ago I saw it, but he's running down the field with a quarterback or a running back, and he's just one step behind him the whole way. It's just remarkable athleticism from a left tackle. So yeah, I agree, I love that pick. So maybe if we, unless Ian, you want to kind of jump into anything, maybe we could talk about kind of how we see the O-line kind of shaping out. Where do you see the 5 starters, and maybe who, because obviously lots of people bring up the concerns of Albert being injury prone, who's kind of that backup left tackle as well.
Yeah, so, adding Turner and adding Juwan James, I've kind of said in the past, it's shaping up to where I think Miami's offensive line is going to become a strength of the team, and when I say that, I don't necessarily mean it's going to be an above-average line right away, first game in, and Tannehill's going to have all this time. Nothing like that, nothing crazy like that. But I do think it's becoming a better unit, especially for the scheme that they want to do, which we can get into that more later or whatever. But, you look at the 5 starters projection-wise, I don't know if it'll happen week 1, but I do expect Turner to start. His main competition is going to be second-year offensive lineman and former third-round pick, Dallas Thomas. It'll be interesting to see, because they didn't give him a vote of confidence by taking Turner. So I don't think the hype that was given out this offseason by Joe Philbin was legit. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that that's motivation, trying to give him a kick in the butt. So obviously, we talk about Brandon Albert and his durability. He rarely completes a season. So that's something to consider ultimately. But I wouldn't be surprised with the Dolphins' insistence on using Thomas as a tackle if he's going to end up being the backup left tackle. And I wouldn't be surprised if we come around to preseason if we're seeing a lot of Thomas at tackle and maybe even a little bit of Turner at tackle, depending on what they want to do with Nate Garner as well. So it just kind of goes back to how they feel about their acquisitions this free agency period, along with last year's acquisition of Dallas Thomas, because one could argue that Jason Fox allows Thomas to change his focus to left tackle as well. So obviously, them seeing those guys in the practice every day is gonna have a big influence on that.
Well, I don't know if Carl, you want to kind of how you envision the O-line with kind of the additions on the off-season, kind of maybe left to right, how you would line it up and players' strengths and weaknesses.
Well, if I was Coach Joe Philbin, I would be very leery about putting 2 rookies next to each other on the offensive line. So I think your best 5 are Pouncey, Albert, Juwan James, Shelley Smith, and Billy Turner. I think Billy Turner has enough talent right off the bat, despite the fact that he's a small school guy. Movement skills, physicality is enough for you to be able to get him in there. Juwan James, by default, is going to be on the right side with Albert on the other side. So it's just essentially a question of which side you want to put the guards. And I would really avoid putting a rookie next to another rookie. So I would put Turner on the left-hand side, let him be that traditional left guard that's a little bit more mobile, the one that pulls, gets out in space, the one you use as your quote-unquote weapon in the run game, getting out in front, getting to the perimeter, and then use Shelley Smith as the traditional right guard, where he's mobile, he's guiding blockers, but he's not really out in space as much, and use him, the fact that he's a veteran, to help bring along Juwan James, make sure there's an understanding from everything that's been said about James. He's a really intelligent guy, but you don't want back-to-back next to each other Billy Turner and Juwan James in my book. So I would go left to right, Albert, Turner, Pouncey, Smith, James.
I would counter that with the Bears kind of got away with having a right side of rookies last year, and they saw an upgrade in that position. And I've noticed one deficiency in Shelley Smith's game is he allows pressure through his left side. So I think he may be right-handed or has more strength in his right lower body. And then at right guard, you're getting pressure in the face of the quarterback. It's the shortest way into the quarterback. And I've talked about this before. And the way I kind of would build an offensive line is I would have, regarding guards, is I'd have my better, or I want a run blocker at left guard and a pass protector at right guard. And I think Billy is pretty good at running in the run game, but that's where Shelley wins in the run game. So I put him at left guard. Also, that deficiency to allow pressure in the left, he's going to be normally sliding to help Albert anyway. It's generally, you're sliding to the left most of the time to help out that blind side. So that rushes, if he is allowing pressure on the left, it's getting slid across to Albert. Whereas at the right side, you're one-on-one, and it's straight in the face of the quarterback. So that would be my preference. It'll be interesting. I think there will be a battle for those three guard places between Dallas, Shelley, and Billy Turner. And there could even be a battle for a tackle spot. It'll be interesting. I think James should win it, but I could imagine Billy trying for it. I know he's said at the Senior Bowl he wants to play guard, and because he likes to get his hands on players. But I think they've definitely built competition with Fox. He won a starting job in Detroit last year before getting hurt week 1. So they've got some depth now and some experience. And also, maybe the most important thing, scheme fit, which has been severely lacking for 2 years, and a good O-line coach. So I think I agree. I don't think it's going to be an area of strength, but as in a top 10 O-line. But generally, zone blocking schemes, they don't grade very well on Pro Football Focus. They don't have huge runs. That's not how the scheme's built. It's about getting 4 yards consistently and not losing yards. So it's always going to be kind of a scheme which maybe irritates fans, or it doesn't have the huge big play factor. It only does when you're running it constantly over 4 quarters, and then the defense is overcompensating for the outside run, and then you cut. It's not really a cutback. You're just taking the final read of the back, and it just all opens up. That's how the big plays come out of the zone blocking scheme for me, is constantly going to it. You're only running 2 plays generally with multiple reads, and it's the overcompensation of the defense that then opens up the big play. And that's kind of why, for me, the running game was never successful, is they gave up on it before you get the big play. And yeah, so I think that will be an improvement. That will help the O-line as well, being more consistent with the run game and actually believing in it. So maybe if we go on to Walt Aikens, I know both of you are fans, so maybe if Ian, you want to start and talk about the 4th round pick.
Yeah, I am a big fan of Aikens, and it was funny. I was talking to Andrew Abramson the week before the draft, just kind of about how the defensive back situation is with Miami. It's kind of a strength with the Dolphins at the end of last year, and then we saw some turnover. We saw Nolan Carroll leave for cheap. We saw Chris Clemens leave for cheap as well, and it didn't seem like they did a whole lot to replace those guys besides signing Cortland Finnegan and Louis Delmas, which are two guys that are really difficult to count on. But so when I saw Walt Aiken's name pop up on the screen, I was super excited. This is a guy with more size than the Dolphins have had in the secondary since Sean Smith was let go. At a little bit over 6 foot tall, he weighs 205 pounds. That's just a lot bigger than what Miami has in the secondary right now, and it's going to help them match up with receivers because especially with the Jets gaining a little bit more size with Jason Morrow and Akins, probably wouldn't line up directly over him, but you want more size to bring a guy like that down because Miami obviously had horrible problems last year tackling. So a scheme that doesn't really, put a lot of emphasis on that pure straight line speed, just got a guy with that speed. So I think Kevin Coyle, the defensive coordinator, is going to have a lot to work with Akins. He's a bit of a raw athlete at this point, but he's got that size, he's got the frame, pretty good speed, as I had mentioned. But what had really kind of drawn me to Akins was when I went to the Senior Bowl, first couple days, he struggled badly, which wasn't a huge concern because he was a small school player. But by Wednesday and Thursday, this was a guy that I was watching every drill, and it kind of surprised me because they were starting to use him in more zone-based coverages, and he was using his length a little bit more effectively, and he really took to coaching well. So I think that as his footwork continues to get more, more refined and a little bit more consistent, and he's able, to stop taking those extra steps on comebacks and such, especially because he has this nasty habit at times where he's trying to mirror the receiver, but he's trying to jump, like he's not really sure of himself. So if he stops crossing his feet and his back pedal and then his transfer forward, I think this is a guy that has a pretty good potential to be at least a solid boundary cornerback, maybe even a potential safety as well. I've seen a little bit of the projection to safety, but I would do everything I possibly could to keep him at cornerback. And I've mentioned this before, he's probably more of a 2015 contributor, considering the Dolphins' depth chart at cornerback, but this is a guy with a high-end potential for me.
Well, we had that question. I think Akins played about 5 or 6 games at safety. So I've also projected him to be a corner. I think day one he's going to be the gunner on special teams. We lost R.J. Stanford, so that is quite an important role, even though maybe no one's kind of talked about it. He was the best gunner. Don Jones had other issues recently, but he wasn't a terribly good gunner, and that was probably the only reason he was drafted in the 7th round last year. So I think that's going to be his immediate value, but you're getting a quality depth potential starter in here. We don't really have anyone that can play and press, and there's goal line situations when you want to kind of stop those quick underneath routes and disrupt the timing. I think maybe day one he'll be kind of used in that role when you're facing empty and you need that 3rd or 4th corner out. So Kyle, do you have any thoughts on the Akins pick?
I really like the Akins pick for them. I actually like Akins better than I liked both the corners they took last year, Jamar Taylor and Will Davis. I think he's got tremendous boundary upside, as Ian had previously mentioned. I saw a lot of the same things about his feet kind of bailing out of his back pedal and getting crossed up at times, but he's a guy who really likes to sit 5 to 8 yards off the ball and utilize that cushion off the snap, and he's got really good ball skills and instincts. There were a number of plays where I saw a 3-step drop, quarterback was still holding on to the football, and the receiver was in his 2nd step into his break on an outbreaking pattern or something coming back. And if Akins is playing a little bit off the line of scrimmage and he's allowed to squat, he's getting downhill in a hurry. And I saw him either break up or intercept a couple passes on last year's tape, sitting off man coverage 5 to 8 yards off the ball, and he's got good enough burst in short areas that he can close that cushion as if he's 8 yards off. So it's just a matter of him being able to consistently find that base that he is so comfortable with when he's sitting in off coverage and driving downhill, for him to be able to sustain a back pedal and get himself into that football position where he can break on passes that take place a little bit further down the field where he's got to maintain cushion as compared to just squatting on the ball. But I think you give him a couple years. This is a kid that got recruited to Illinois, so you know the talent's there. That's never been a question. You see the athleticism, the length. I think he's much more fluid as far as change of direction and just general speed than Sean Smith was. That was a guy that you guys had mentioned as somebody who'd been let go a couple years ago, went to Kansas City. I think that's a really nice addition to the Dolphins secondary, and I think he's going to surpass a lot of the guys come 2015 that are on the depth chart in front of him right now.
Well, I think that's kind of going to be, I can imagine this being the future kind of corner group to go for a while, with Will Davis as that nickel corner, slot corner, and then you have Jamal Taylor and Akins as the two boundary corners when Grimes, and I think Colin Finnegan has been brought in to be a slot corner personally. That's where he predominantly played his past 2 years and was a Titans. So I think that is a competition between him and Davis to play the slot. I really like Jamal Taylor. I had him as my second corner behind Desmond Trufant last year. I think I really like his hip snap and aggressiveness. And he had pretty good ball skills. I always like Boise State corners as well. I think they're well coached. And Davis, I think, once his hips are turned and he loses the ball already, and he just loses receivers, I think we've got to keep everything in front of him, which they kind of do in Miami anyway. They let their corners sit deep and then attack the receiver, attack the ball. So I think that's kind of, he's suited to that aspect of the game. He may give up receptions inside, but he's not going to be giving up many yards after, and he'll make the play on the ball as well occasionally. But I think that's a nice young core with Coyle to coach up, even if the secondary or the second safety position is maybe the weakest position at the moment in that kind of backfield. And maybe if we go on to Arthur Lynch, he's an interesting pick for me. I think it kind of shows the coaching staff aren't that convinced in Sims after a pretty poor rookie year. He had about 300 snaps. I think fans like him because he had a touchdown, but his job is to block, and he was probably the worst offensive skill player in my eyes last year. And he was, Clay and Agnew were better blockers in both areas of the game, and one of them's a receiver and one of them's basically a slot receiver, so that's pretty damning. So I think Lynch is going to be, I don't think he's a great athlete. He's really stiff in the hips. He kind of moves like an offensive lineman. He's not terribly strong. He's got pretty strong hands, but he can kind of get thrown around a bit. Yeah, I think he's only going to be kind of used in the passing game, kind of play action when he's kind of falling out of the line and kind of like chips and moves out. I think that's kind of the way he'll be used in the passing game. It's something Laser did a lot in Virginia. So that kind of makes sense to me. So I don't know if, Kyle, you want to talk about Lynch and how you kind of see his skills.
I like him as that traditional inline guy who you're not relying on to make big plays. The big thing that stuck out with me when I watched Lynch was he has consistent hands until they mean something. Georgia lost 3 games in the fourth quarter on their final possession because he dropped the first down conversion or a touchdown. So I think as long as you're not putting him into that spot where he's consistently, especially in high volume, getting out into pass patterns, he's a very serviceable receiver. He's big enough that he can give some safeties fits if he gets that matchup. And he's just crisp enough out in space running routes to be able to separate a bit from linebackers, but he's by no means the kind of matchup nightmare that Charles Clay is for the Dolphins. Clay's a really nice move piece for them, and I find it very hard to believe that they have anybody on that roster that's going to knock Clay off that spot. I think he's a very nice piece. In 2013, he really came into his own as far as coming down the stretch and making a lot of plays, whether it was down the field or run after the catch for the Dolphins. So Lynch is that guy who's going to come in on 2 tight end sets, put his hand in the ground, mix it up with linebackers and defensive ends on the edge, try and set the perimeter or just turn a guy out. And like Oscar, you had mentioned, you get him play action passes, let him leak out, get up over top of the linebackers if you're hammering him away with a run game, and he can do some damage there. But he's not going to be an every down player. He's going to be a supplemental piece. And I think as long as you choose your spots with him, he can provide some really nice value.
I like his body control in the receiving game. I think he kind of uses his body well. He can get up. Yeah, I don't really see the kind of quick hips to get separation. You can find soft spots, I think, and that's kind of like his best attribute in the passing game. Is he'll be that kind of third read or fourth read where he's just found space somewhere like underneath. But yeah, I've seen people kind of saying this means the end of days for Egni, but they didn't really find anyone that has that skill set of vertical seam threat. I don't think even Clay kind of really offers that kind of deep seam, and that is something that Laser uses in his offense. Virginia and if elements of Chip Kelly's offense come with Laser, that was kind of another thing they used quite prominently in Philadelphia and Oregon. So I think that's kind of something that's been misunderstood. And I think that's kind of just people looking at snap count and thinking that's success. So Ian, I don't know if you have any thoughts on Arthur that we haven't kind of brought up.
No, I think you guys nailed it. That's Arthur Lynch in a few-minute discussion. You guys nailed it, I think.
Okay.
I'm excited for him, though. I will say that. I'm excited to see. I'm excited to get Deion Sims off the field as much as possible. So.
And so I guess the next pick we'll go on to is Trep. So I guess if you want to talk about him as you get the joy of talking about an inline blocker.
Who's talking?
Sorry.
Ian, you can.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, so Jordan Tripp, this was a really nice pick, I think, for Miami. As a hybrid linebacker, I guess you could say he could play maybe inside or outside. I thought that was kind of an interesting discussion because you look at what he did in the All-Star games. They had him playing both, and he looked good inside. I thought. I haven't watched a ton of film on him, but what I did see was I thought it was good. I think I'd prefer to see him at weak side linebacker. Let him just clean up plays and use his athleticism a little bit more. He's a little undersized. I think he weighs like 235 pounds. So ultimately,
arms, which is my kind of concern of that's the size issue I have is the arm length more than the weight, height.
Right, and especially as he starts to deal with the bigger NFL players coming from a smaller school. I'm not overall against smaller school players or anything like that, but I think he's going to have a bit of an adjustment. He's got great speed. He definitely infuses a little bit more athleticism into the Dolphins roster, which is a huge bonus. But I'm not sure if this is a guy that 2014 we're going to see a huge payoff for, which you could say with I think a couple guys in this draft class. Ultimately, he reads plays extremely well. I think that's a bonus for if Miami wants to try to move him inside. He reacts quickly and efficiently. He's not. I don't think he was the most fluid athlete I saw, but if he can move efficiently like the way he does and kind of attack the line of scrimmage as effectively as he did at Montana, and just continue to improve that, then I think he's a player. I'm just not sure if he's an immediate impact type of player.
Oh, so this is the question we got kind of about. There's Dolphins obviously want to improve, or Dolphin fans have a lust for a new Mike linebacker. So maybe Carl, if you want to talk about kind of schematically how he works in a 4-3, where do you think he wins and loses at weak side or Mike?
Well, as Ian mentioned, I think his best fit is as a 4-3 will. And that would improve the Dolphins if they got him on the field in passing situations twofold, because that means Philip Wheeler is no longer asked to get into coverage. But Tripp, when you watch him, he excels in pass coverage, kind of like the A.J. Eds pick from Iowa several years ago. I know the Dolphins ran a 4-3 or 3-4 at the time and kind of used him as a coverage inside linebacker before he got hurt. That pick never really panned out. But this is a guy who's similar with his strengths in pass coverage coming out of college. I don't think he's going to be able to push into the starting lineup by any means. He's an exceptional athlete, just going off of the athleticism testing that off-ball linebackers going over from over the last decade. He almost was in the top 5 percentile in everything. You know, he was really, really strong athletically. So I don't think just because he's coming from Montana he's going to push Ellerbe or Wheeler. But I will give you a name that I think he will push, and that's Jason Trusnick. I think he can really push Trusnick as far as special team snaps. Trusnick over the last couple of years, they brought him in from Cleveland. He had a really strong year in Cleveland and left for free agency. And from what I've seen, Trusnick, it seems like he's got 1 or 2 holding penalties on returns every year that bring back a big return. So I'm not sure the economics of Trusnick's contract off the top of my head, but I think Tripp can offer very similar value. And I know Trusnick was a guy that in a pinch that they threw in the 4-3. I think they mixed him both at inside and outside. So, if they feel comfortable with him in that potential role, he might be a guy that pushes Trusnick off a roster spot.
Yeah, I think I think that's why he's kind of here for as special teams first, and then I think he could be used maybe if they have a rotation at will and they have in blitzing situations they have Wheeler. That's kind of his strength. That's all he's really been. That's his best attribute is in blitzing double-A blitzes and coming off the edge. He's very efficient in that way, but in coverage, Wheeler's just pretty much useless with he's got such a wide upper body that he just can't move. His bottom half is so much faster than his top half. So that's kind of like the advantage Tripp has. I think he's good in space and it's a good match up to slot receivers or backs and even tight ends. He can kind of make plays on the ball that way. I really liked Tripp, but only as a weak side linebacker. I think as soon as you're putting him inside, he's going to get offensive linemen on him and then he just can't get off them. He couldn't at the level of competition he was at, so I don't see how you can project him having a hope in hell doing it in the pros. Maybe he can beat them with speed and instincts, but I mean that's a big if, and if he doesn't, you're allowing yourselves to get beaten in the run game quite significantly. So I'd keep him clean at will, let him clean up, kind of just be that kind of aggressive player that you just let roam and be free. So I think that's kind of where he wins. I don't really see. I think he could play inside in a 3-4 as that will inside. But as a Mike linebacker, I don't think he could survive with that arm length, that strength. He's already 24, so you can't really project him to get any stronger. I think he's built out of his frame. So that's kind of what he is what you get. Maybe you can. Maybe the speed of the game will be an issue for him at first. Obviously, the step up. So that's going to be kind of one thing to look for, because that's quite an important position, element in that position is kind of the speed of the game, how quickly it comes to you, how quickly you have to diagnose the plays. So that'll be interesting to see kind of how he does, but I definitely think he's going to be a will as well. And then, so maybe if we move on to, I guess Matt Hazel was the next pick, maybe we can talk about kind of how we see the now quite congested wide receiver core, where kind of people line up, whether you think Hazel adds anything new. Obviously, he's got a great surname, apart from he's missing an L, but he's all right in that regard. But where do you kind of see his tools projecting, and where do you think he'll be lined up within the core? Maybe, Ian, if you want to go with this one.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of Matt Hazel. I think that this is a guy that sort of similar to Jarvis Landry as far as what he brings to the table immediately for the Dolphins. He's a polished route runner, strong hands. Is a guy that he just finds the way to get open. Good size, good speed. 6'1", 200 pounds. Surprisingly, ran a 4.5 flat at the 40 on the 40-yard dash at the combine. I thought that was a little surprising. I'm not sure if he showed that suddenness and that quick twitch athleticism. But he's straight line speed. That's fine. He's not going to take the top of the defense ever, and that's fine for Miami's offense. They don't really look to do that except for the occasional deep ball to Wallace, and that's something. That is what it is, and that's elsewhere. So the Hazel drafting was kind of surprise to me because I didn't expect them to go small school receiver with limited upside after they already took Landry. And just for the record, I'm a fan of both, but I kind of expected them to go for it with a bigger receiver with maybe a higher upside because Hazel doesn't really have a huge upside. I compared him to James Jones, who Philbin worked with in Green Bay. This is a bigger slot player, can do a little bit of everything with him, but he's not going to be, that number one type receiver that you put out there every week. And like I said, the West Coast offense, that's not a huge issue. Ultimately, I think he comes in right away and challenges and probably takes the roster spot of maybe Armand Binns and Damian Williams. It's definitely going to push those guys, I think, down a little bit on the depth chart. And you probably see, I think Hazel's going to come out in the preseason and probably just tear it up, and fans are going to be like going crazy. But it'll be an interesting dynamic to see how Miami handles Hazel and then Rashard Matthews because I think they're somewhat similar players.
I think one aspect of his game I really like is how he locates the ball. I think that's kind of a really nice kind of trait that you can't teach. He locates the ball well. You late hand pluck them. So that's kind of things that are really translatable, and you can't develop that attribute very often. I kind of agree. I think he's going to be kind of like he moves around. He's not spectacular anywhere, but he's going to be solid. I think what will be interesting is how many wide receivers, how many running backs they carry. Maybe if they find one of these later wide receivers that they think can be a returner, maybe that drops Big Pen and they carry 6 wide receivers. So that maybe that could be the Damian Williams, the running back, or the Damian Williams, the receiver. But yeah, I think that's kind of going to be his role. So Kyle, what do you think of the Hazel pick?
Well, a lot was really made about the Dolphins ripping off a bunch of small school prospects. But Dennis Higgy made a good point when explaining these selections. He said, competition changes on a week-to-week basis. And Hazel, if you watch his South Carolina film, he absolutely ate up Victor Hampton. So Victor Hampton was a guy that was fairly highly regarded coming into the draft process. He didn't end the draft process so well. But he was a very talented football player, and Hazel did a lot of work on him, and I had the opportunity to also see Hazel at the East-West Shrine game. And I saw 3 days' worth of him going up against Pierre Desir at practice. There's Andre Howell at practice, Ross Cockrell at practice. These are guys that were 4th, 5th round draft picks to be boundary corners for teams, and some of which were considered to have very high upside. And Hazel could not be covered. He's very sharp with his route running, very efficient with his feet. He's economical with the steps that he takes in his routes run and breaking down, getting into his breaks. And surprisingly, as Ian said, you weren't expecting 4.5 flat, but you did see on the couple opportunities where he got the ball out on the boundary, and after the catch, he does have some nice short area second gear to get up into. So I think he's a guy that, just based off his polish, despite being a small school guy, I would say he's a guarantee to make the roster. I would not question whatsoever that Matt Hazel is going to be on the 2014 Dolphins roster. I also think he's a comparable player to Rashard Matthews. He's a better athlete than Rashard Matthews. But at the same time, Rashard Matthews did a really nice job filling in for Brandon Gibson, so I would have a hard time letting him go as well. So I don't know if Gibson's going to be 100% healthy by the time spring or training camp comes around, maybe Gibson starts the year on the PUP and they cross that bridge when they get there a little later on. But I would definitely say Hazel, just based on what he brings to the table, is a guy that, again, fits that Green Bay Packers mold. You want guys that can run routes and have reliable hands, and they can produce some run after the catch, but they're not blazing fast guys. This is another pick, just like Jarvis Landry, that fits into that exact same mold.
I just want to touch on two more things as you kind of brought up, and just like a fun fact, do you guys know who the only receiver in 2013 to actually beat Walt Aikens consistently in a game was actually Matt Hazel. Matt Hazel ended up beating him for I charted the game 6 catches for 100 yards. So Aikens the rest of the season was a complete lockdown receiver, and Hazel just went in there and, a lesser athlete than Aikens, and just outclassed him with his polish. So I thought that was an excellent point. And then kind of getting back to, like you mentioned about Brandon Gibson and his health, as soon as they took Landry, I was kind of thinking it to myself, okay, what's this mean about Gibson? And then they took Matt Hazel, and I think it absolutely means that whatever's happening with Brandon Gibson's recovery, it must not be going as well as hoped. That's the only thing I think you can assume, because even with the recent news that the Dolphins aren't exactly thrilled with Rashard Matthews, which is kind of strange to me, there must be something going on there, because his contract, the Dolphins can release him at any time for $500,000 or something, and he was so good last year, so it's strange that they would just automatically kind of cast him aside. So I'm wondering if that knee is really having issues.
Well, that's interesting with Gibson, because they did put out that, or Gibson's side did put out that he was ahead of schedule with his recovery, so perhaps that was a smokescreen to kind of put teams off that they were in the wide receiver market. I think if you look at the depth chart, they're not really tied to anyone come next year or the next couple of years. I don't think they haven't really taken anyone that's going to challenge Wallace as the number one. I think Hartline and Tannehill's chemistry is obviously good, but I think in this offense you want to have a lot of pieces that you can move around and can be versatile, and you want to have bunch sets and you don't know where anyone's going to go, and that's kind of a good attribute, especially with smaller guys, a good way to get them with a free release, having those bunch sets, especially when you're kind of facing the Jets and they have those bigger corners. I think the Victor Hampton point was interesting. He shut down Sammy Watkins a couple of times, so it kind of shows that when maybe that's playing up and then down to competition on Victor Hampton's part, but that kind of shows kind of the quality he was up against and still thrived. And we'll go to the last pick. I don't know if either of you had watched much of Terrence Foudet. So I guess maybe we'll ask you two, and then if you haven't, I can chime in, because I was lucky enough to be given a heads up on him.
Well, I do not have notes on him. I had a set list, and from there once I filled out my original 300 prospects, I just went back and tried to fill up as much as possible. I ended up watching around 350 and published 328, and he was none of the players from Marist were amongst those, so I don't have any notes on him.
The only stuff that I had was stuff that I took after we drafted him. Actually, as soon as I finished my rapid reaction to him, I had about 45 minutes to still write him up, so I scrambled to YouTube and just tried to take any notes possible that I had on him. I'm impressed with his size, 6'4", 276 pounds, great strength. He's raw as hell as can be, but I think if he can learn to get his leverage, more consistent, stay lower with his pad level, start using his hands a little bit less robotically. It's a 2 or 3 year project that Casey Rogers is, the defensive line coach, is just going to love. I think he's going to have his hands all over him as a rookie, and he might be a practice squad player, but he's oozing with potential. I think you could see that just from the game or two that's available online. And for a 7th round pick, it's kind of what you expect. You either take a really accomplished college player that you're not sure translates and you take a flyer on him, or you want to take a guy like this that you have no clue if he's, when it's going to finally click for him or if it's going to click for him, but at least the athletic upside was there. And Oscar, I know you have a lot more in-depth analysis than I do on that, so I don't know if you want to kind of add to that.
Well, I was lucky. I was given a tip by James Coburn to check him out, and then I think 3 days later, it came out that the Dolphins had him in for a visit. So I was kind of lucky, and that was kind of around the time when all the talk about the smart board and the analytics kind of side were coming out, and they had Garrett Scott visiting and players like that. So I've watched quite a bit of him. I predicted him along with Aikens as kind of 6 of the players that could be drafted in the 3rd day. And he is just a beast of a freak. He dominated competition, is what you look for in small players, even with bad technique. He comes off the ball really quickly, but he's up like a ladder, basically. So he's a big guy, so he's a big target for offensive linemen, but he's got different rush moves to kind of get off those blocks. So that's kind of interesting to show a player that even when he's got hands on his chest, he's still got various ways to get out. I like the way he locates the ball. I think I've charted maybe 10 or so over 2 years. I watched about 8 or 9 games of his. He had so many tip balls at the line of scrimmage, generally on passes to the side, like behind the line of scrimmage. But in the college game, that's a large part of the passing game, so that kind of awareness is really nice, because that's a big part of the game. So that maybe doesn't translate well, but it's still kind of showing awareness where the ball is, kind of how plays develop and tendencies. Maybe shows he has a good handle on watching film and seeing how teams attack and what formations, what tendencies they have. That was really interesting. And he is just, off the snap, his length, his hand use, they're all he's got tools to be a really good player. I think having Cameron Wake to help him, if he can just come off the ball low, he could be a devastating player. I haven't seen bend from him, which is maybe a concern. But he's shown flashes of speed to power, which is when he gets in front into the pads of the offensive lineman, he just rams them and sits them on top of the quarterback, which is always fun to see. I was really excited when I saw this pick. I think Billy, I was like over the moon and ecstatic, and then this pick, I really wanted Zachary Kerr, the defensive tackle from Delaware. But when I saw this, this shows that they're looking for raw gems, and as I said earlier, last year they took a gunner in the 7th round, and this year they took a raw edge rusher. And to me, that's more exciting and has more potential for growth, and shows they're projecting forward. They're wanting to develop raw freak talent that you don't get them often. You draft raw freak talent, in my opinion. That's something you prioritize, especially in the late rounds. And he'll probably be able to have some sort of impact on special teams. It'll be interesting whether he makes the final roster and how quickly he develops. Hopefully we see a lot of him in preseason. I think it'll be really fun to see him against some really bad left tackles. So that'll be interesting. And if we see Dion Jordan, Uday, each side of each other, that could be the future pass rush of the Dolphins post-Wake. So I was really excited about that pick. I know no one else kind of was, especially Rich Eisen. He was pretty disgusted. But I think the Dolphins went for raw athletic ability over poor SEC production, in regards to not picking Michael Sam, who you wouldn't get a sniff at the roster and would never see a snap, whereas Uday, if he projects the way his athletic traits look, he could be, in my opinion, a starting edge rusher in the league in 3-4 years. So I thought that was maybe my favourite pick, just kind of showing the direction they're willing to go in, and I think the early round picks we saw, they were plugging holes, and once they got to Billy Turner and Tripp and Uday, that was showing that what they kind of covered as a prospect and what attributes they covered. So that was like a promising thing for me. So maybe if we quickly go through, before we get to the undrafted free agents and kind of pick up any kind of we think that may make the roster, or a couple of it will be stashed in the practice squad. Maybe we'll quickly go through the AFC East. We'll be seeing them twice a year, and let's go. I guess we'll go alphabetically and start with the Bills. And obviously, they mortgaged the future to get Sammy Watkins. They obviously didn't. Maybe they didn't like Mike Evans, or didn't think he would get there either. I wouldn't blame them for not liking Mike Evans personally, but Kyle, how do you feel about Sammy Watkins taking what they spent to get him?
I really disagree with giving up so much to move up. I believe it was 5 spots. I didn't have Watkins as a top 10 talent. I thought he was a solid first-round talent, but he would have been a guy I would have been comfortable taking if I was Detroit at 10, or if the Giants, which it turns out they were in the market for a wide receiver, him at 12. But to give up an additional first-round pick from the future, go up and get Sammy Watkins, I didn't like the value. And in general, I wasn't really blown away with their first 2 days in general. Between him and Kwanjo, I'm not a real big fan of Kwanjo. He's got some knee concerns, and he's really similar to a lot of players that they've already got. You look at Cordy Glenn. Cordy Glenn's a left tackle that's a little bit heavy-footed himself. He does surprisingly well on the left side, considering I thought he was through and through strictly a right tackle. But I don't think that they did a really nice job until the tail end of their draft getting good value for their selections.
Ian, do you want to kind of talk about those first 2 rounds, or any kind of like players they got later on? I think they got Preston Brown. To me, kind of feels like he'll be the replacement to Brandon Spikes, that 2-down linebacker, as they move to a 4-3. So Spikes was on a 1-year deal, so maybe they're kind of hoping Brown can take over him. I like the Ross Cockrell pick a lot. I really liked him. He was kind of that leader of that Duke secondary, really smart kid. I think he had that ACL at the end of during kind of the off-season circuit, I believe. And then they took a flyer on Trell, which I guess you got to like, Siontrell Henderson. I think if you can get him off smoking weed every day, maybe he and teach him how to play football. He could be a good player, but those are some big Fs. I think
that's a really big F, Oscar.
Yeah, he loves weed more than he loves football, so that's good. But the Bills can deal with that.
Yeah, I liked what they did on day 2 a little bit more than I should say round 3 and 4, since they've changed the draft layout a little bit. Round 3, I liked how they added Preston Brown. That was, I think, a target for the Dolphins in that 3rd to 4th round area, specifically more the 4th round after they traded up for Billy. But he's a little bit more of a hammer, hard-hitting guy. They're trying to go with more of a speedy offense and combine that with a powerful, intimidating defense. Fit well into that. He's a little bit stiff in the hips, so as far as coverage, I'm not sure he's going to be able to do a whole lot. So if I'm Miami, I'm going to try to isolate Brown and Charles Clay as much as possible. But they're pretty good at what they do in Buffalo as far as defensive schemes. So I'm not sure that's going to happen far too often. And then Ross Cockrell's a guy I was hoping Miami would take until we took Walt Aikens a little bit after that. So ultimately, I think Cockrell, he's a guy. He can do a little bit of everything. He's good in man coverage. He's good in zone. He pressed a lot at Duke, but projecting forward, I don't think he's going to be able to press at all because he has really short arms, less than 30 inches, despite his 6-foot frame. So, but ultimately, though, you take a guy like that in the 4th round, and it's okay because you don't need him to become a lockdown press corner. Within their scheme, he's going to fit fairly well. And then round 5, Cyril Richardson, I was higher on him than most people. He kind of just plays within a phone booth, and you just let him do his thing one-on-one. Obviously, in this division, I think it's going to be interesting to see how he holds up because there's a lot of good defensive schemes in this division. So maybe this wasn't the best division for him to come to, but the Bills, I thought they got stronger as they kind of drafted on. I thought the first two rounds kind of agree with Kyle and you, Oscar, that I'm not really sure what they were really doing. I don't think they received good value at all for either of their first two picks. I don't really think they really needed Sammy. I mean, I love Sammy Watkins, but I don't really know you needed him, especially to give up a 2015 first, because I mean, you saw E.J. Manuel last year, and he was awful. And then when he wasn't, when he wasn't hurt, he really couldn't get a rhythm going. So it'll be interesting to see if Doug Marrone even lasts till their next first round pick, which will be 2016. I got hyped up during the draft and said that he wouldn't. So I don't know. Maybe I got too worked up over that trade.
It felt like a move that they know they're on their last kind of straw, obviously, with turmoil with the team being bought. I hope he does kind of stay there. He was a London Monarch, my old NFL Europe team in London. I used to play flag football when I was a kid. He was an offensive lineman for them for a year. So I like him personally, and I like what he did at Syracuse. So I like the coach, but yeah, I think the moves they look like they were they're tied to this quarterback that isn't great, and they kind of want to make sure he works. They basically gave up a first round pick and Stevie Johnson to get a Sammy Watkins. I don't really see the production you're getting out of Sammy Watkins being terribly improved over Stevie Johnson personally, and you're giving up a lot more to get him. So I wasn't a fan of that move. And then maybe if we go on to the Jets, who they kind of had an up and down draft to me. There's a couple of picks I really hate and a couple of picks I really like. I'll be nice first and do the picks I like. I like Dexter McDougal. Shaq Evans was one of the kind of wide receivers I really liked. I thought it was underrated, and I was really happy he went in the fourth round, just not where he went to. And then Dakota Dozier, who I think is a really nice interior lineman in his own blocking scheme. And then, I guess Amaro's interesting. I think I quite like Cumberland personally as a tight end, but I think Amaro, he won't really be in line. He'll just be kind of that slot receiver, maybe play outside some more, so he's just going to be a bigger receiver. So I think I like their receiving core. I'm not a big fan of Yalen Saunders that much. I think he's just kind of maybe he brings some return skills, and he plays bigger than his size, as in he's aggressive and kind of nasty receiver, but he isn't a great route runner. He's not really bursting separation. And Pryor, I think, is just awful. I don't know why people think he's a free safety. He's just a box safety, in my opinion, and not a very good one. So he may be as useful in a Rex Ryan defense. Most people are. But I think I was pretty happy they went that route at 18. So I guess, Kyle, if you have any thoughts on what the Jets did, the highs and lows, as an impartial critic.
I actually did a piece in comparison with my big board, my evaluations, and I graded based on tiers. I have a top 10 first round, early second round, which would be the first 10 picks of the second round, second round, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, undrafted free agent. Those are the tiers that I slot players in when I do my evaluations. And I lined up for every selection what tier their pick was in and what tier that I graded the player that they picked in. And the Jets had one of the worst overall draft grades when you're looking at the value that they got for their selections. They had the 17th overall pick, and they took Calvin Pryor, who I graded as a fourth-round talent. Going down a little bit further, Dexter McDougal was a guy that, Oscar, you mentioned you had liked. I had him as a late day 3 player just because of the injury that he had. He's got nice movement skills, but I didn't put him very high. It was another pick that really hurt them. They had 3 guys in day 3 that didn't even make my cut as draftable players. Quincy Enunwa from Nebraska was a guy I saw at the Shrine game. Physical upside with him is apparent, but honestly, I don't see him producing into anything whatsoever. Jeremiah George, the linebacker, they took him in the 5th round. Really small, undersized. I was really surprised to see him go in the 5th round, especially with some of the other linebackers that were still on the board. They started out day 3 really strong. I thought Jalen Saunders was a strong pick for them because they need some run after the catch ability, and he can provide that. He's obviously going to be a special teams weapon. He was an outstanding return man in Oklahoma. I was interested, Oscar, to hear you say that you didn't think he was a good route runner. I thought he was one of the best route runners in the class, just as far as his breaks and how he sells his routes at the top of his stem. You know, you watch the Alabama game, and he was just schooling that secondary the entire game, and I thought it was a good personification of what I saw, you know, when they played Baylor. He showed really strong against Baylor as well. But I thought their best pick was their last one. Trevor Riley, the rush linebacker from Utah. I thought, you know, he had some injury problems in the offseason during this season, but he's a pretty gritty ball player, and I think that was their best value pick out of the entire class, was their very last selection.
And they drafted Taj Boyd as well, which was pretty much, unless they're using him as a fullback, I think that's a wasted pick, personally. I guess, Ian, do you want... maybe I'll talk about kind of like what I didn't like about Jalen Saunders, kind of the way he runs routes I don't like. I think there's kind of an arc on his routes at the top of them sometimes, and I think they're going to be undercut in the pros. I think he gets separation, but I think because he's going to be doing so much underneath, I think that kind of arc you're going to see more athletic players kind of go underneath, and especially with Gino, he kind of looks down players. I think that kind of the combination with Dexter McDougal, I like him as a player. I didn't like him as a 3rd-round pick or to the Jets. I don't really see that fit, but I think he's a player I liked, but definitely not. I think I had him in the 4th or 5th round, and just kind of like out of raw athletic ability and kind of like the way he attacks the ball I thought was intriguing. And I loved Shaq Evans. He was one of my favorite receivers in this class. So I thought that was probably that. I think he could easily turn into what Sammy Watkins could be. He kind of has similar traits to me, kind of similar stature. If you teach him how to run routes, then he could be really good. So Ian, if you want to kind of talk about the Jets, and we'll get on to the Patriots.
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, I agree with you guys. It was really up and down draft. Hated the Calvin Pryor pick. And actually, let me rephrase that. As a Dolphins person, loved their pick of Calvin Pryor because it didn't make any. Okay, it made some sense because Rex Ryan, I'm sure, will love having that piece, and he'll probably put Pryor in the best position to succeed. But as far as a value standpoint, Kyle's absolutely right. It was horrible value. I had him as a 3rd-round pick after I went back and looked at him for a 3rd time. There's just no instincts there. I mean, he sees what he wants to see as soon as the play starts. And what I mean by that is, if you're showing a run and it's an actual play action, he's just going to run like a torpedo into that backfield. In the NFL, he's going to get laid out by a fullback or a guard that's doesn't have a blocker on top of him or something. It's just going to be very interesting to see how exactly Calvin Pryor wins, because everyone talks about how aggressive he is, but he's too aggressive. So can you actually refine him and actually make him more effective with his aggressiveness? Because I kind of have this belief that, can you actually take away a trait of a player like that and still keep him effective when that's the number one trait of that player? So he's got some athletic upside, but ultimately I don't think that was a very solid pick by them. And I'm just kind of looking at the rest of their draft. I like Jason Morrow. I think that was a nice pickup, and you guys kind of hit on everyone else. I mean, it's a very interesting draft. I mean, it feels very random. You could argue that they were adding size and aggressiveness, and then they took Saunders, and I don't know. It just seems like a random put together Band-Aid draft.
I guess now we can go to the Patriots, who have been kind of, I think they've been somewhat bashed for their second round pick in particular. They're almost doing the opposite of what Denver are doing, where they're Denver are going all out to give pace and weapons, whereas the Patriots are kind of somewhat building for the future with Dominic Easley maybe having to be on IR coming off his second ACL injury, then getting Jimmy Garoppolo, and then I think they did well in the offensive line. Stork is a smart player. I liked he's very versatile. I think he can work in any scheme. He wasn't my highest center at the time. In fact, the Florida center Harrison, who went undrafted, I prefer. Fleming, I think he dropped somewhat because of Jonathan Martin, kind of that same position. There was kind of word he was like of similar, I wouldn't say mindset, but he has opportunities outside football, so whether kind of like it's his real passion being kind of questioned somewhat. But I think he's a big mauling right tackle and he's really talented. So I think that was a steal in the late fourth round. And then Jalapio, another a Florida guard who kind of had a pec injury, didn't look very good this year. The year before, he looked slightly better still. I wasn't a big fan, but I know some other people were. So maybe if Kyle, you want to talk about kind of how you feel about. I'm a huge fan of Dominic Easley, so I think that was a brilliant pick for them. If he still has that first step, which he did after his first ACL, I think he looked even better. So I think you can project he's going to be fine. Obviously, no ACL surgery is the same, but if you recovered from one, generally you're going to recover from your next one, particularly as it's in a different knee. So I don't know how you feel about that class.
I'm a little leery with Easley. The skill set, the first step, the burst, the anticipation, it's all there. He is talent-wise what people wanted Sharif Floyd to be last year. He's extremely disruptive, penetration player, and if he is healthy, it's going to pan out and it's going to work great. But I would be extremely leery taking a player with a tear in both knees because statistically speaking, from a medical standpoint, you are significantly at higher risk for a repeat tear after an ACL tear. And to get a tear in each knee, it's not a good start. And people kind of justified that pick with saying that, oh, the Patriots have depth and they have a really talented roster, so they can afford to take a chance like this in the first round. Their roster's really not all that talented. They have really good coaching, which produces a lot of turnovers on the defensive side of the football, and they have Tom Brady. You look at their weapons. Their weapons last year really could have used a bit of an upgrade in the draft. I was surprised to see them take James White as their first offensive weapon, and the only other guy that they drafted was Jeremy Gallen out of Michigan in the 7th round. So I was surprised that was the direction that they went, especially because this is a team that needs to start preparing for life after Tom Brady, and you need as talented of a roster from top to bottom as you can get. So the talent, there's no question about the talent. I'm not questioning the talent. I'm just saying, me personally as an evaluator, I would not have opted to spend a first-round pick on a player with an ACL tear in both knees. Garoppolo, I think there were better quarterbacks on the board. I personally think Garoppolo is a bit overhyped. I did not see this outstanding decision maker. He's got a quick release. He moves fairly well, but mechanically his throwing platform is way off. He's way too wide, and it manifests itself with his ability to place balls when he's throwing down the field. You'll see a lot of high throws. You'll see a lot of one-hoppers, and it's because his base is so wide at times that he really doesn't have an ability to stride into a throw because his feet, when he sets, is already so far apart. I thought their best pick was the Cameron Fleming pick. I really like that pick, especially down in the 4th round. Jalapio is another good pick. I really like the James White pick as well. I think he's a fairly versatile back. Caught over 30 passes this year. It was the first opportunity he really had to flash that he can contribute in the receiving game. On the whole, I didn't think that they got a player based off of my evaluations of my board, that was worth anything more than a third-round pick, top to bottom. So they did a really nice job adding a lot of solid pieces, but I don't think they added any pieces that are going to be outstanding for them.
Well, I quite like the easily pick just for, I think in previous drafts they've kind of always gone for solid role players, players that have a role, and this is kind of one opportunity they had to take a player that has real elite traits, and so I think I like that kind of risk reward they took. It's an area of need with Vince Wilfork also coming off that same injury, but he's a lot bigger and it's harder for the bigger guys to kind of recover from that kind of strain. Obviously, I mean, easily still pretty big, but he's not a Wilfork.
Right.
So I quite like that they're kind of betting on elite talent, which they haven't really done before, or they haven't done for a long time. They've kind of gone for players that Bill Belichick can seize a role for or multiple roles for. So I quite like that. I think they were unlucky. I think they wanted a tight end to fall in the second round, and that maybe pushed them in the direction of drafting Jimmy. I think if a tight end had fallen, that would have been kind of the route they would have gone. Ian, I don't know if you want to say anything about, we've kind of talked about Jimmy Garoppolo in a couple of hangouts before, so we're not huge fans with the way like he takes on, sees pressure and reacts to pressure, and that could be related to his base as well. He has quick feet when there's no pressure around him, but then they get real, because they're so wide, they get real murky once he's kind of reacting to seeing flashes of colour. So Ian, if you want to kind of talk, and then we'll go into the undrafted free agents.
Yeah, I'll just kind of touch on that. You know, we've talked about Garoppolo before. I mean, he just plays at such a frenetic pace. Everything to his game is just so quick. And, you know, that sounds like, you know, a positive, but when you translate it to the NFL, you really need to slow things down. And he's got quick eyes. He notices things well, but, you know, it's just something seems off when you watch Garoppolo. You know, besides the things that you guys noted. You know, we've never really seen at least I've never really seen a quarterback come into the NFL like he is. The way he just kind of pitter patters his feet constantly. You know, the way he moves around in the pocket, it's different, and I don't think it'll translate very well ultimately. So it was an interesting pick. I mean, their draft in a whole is kind of a different breed for them. Like Kyle mentioned, I mean, there's not really a great value outside of. I personally think Easley is a really good value, but as soon as you factor the health in, I don't even know if that's really a value at 28 or whatever, because we just don't know about the knees. I had him as a top 5 talent before, you know, trying to consider anything with the injuries, and then you start talking about the injuries and just who has a clue. I mean, so it'll be really interesting to see. I mean, the end part of their draft was interesting. I thought Jalapio was an okay pick. Zach Moore was a little bit more of a higher potential pick, coming out of a small school. And then Jamea Thomas is a guy I'm not at all a fan of, and Jeremy Gallen. I loved him in college, but I mean 5'7.5". I'm not sure, you know, what he can do unless if he's in like a Danny Woodhead role, maybe catching balls out of the backfield and occasional slot play. So I just don't think it was a typical Patriots draft. I'm not sure even like the biggest homers for the Patriots could even say that this was a great draft without a doubt. So it'll be interesting to see how this draft develops in 2014.
I guess we're pretty lucky to have both of you. Ian, you obviously went to the Senior Bowl, and Carl, you went to the East West Shrine game. So you kind of you've seen in person kind of a couple of the undrafted free agents we've taken on. So maybe if Ian, you want to start with, are there any guys you particularly like that you saw in person or outside of the Senior Bowl that you kind of think may be practice squad or even make the roster?
Are we just looking at the Dolphins specifically?
Yeah, we'll just go to the Dolphins, and maybe if there's like anyone else kind of you saw drop out, we can talk about.
Okay. To start with the Dolphins, I really like Brock Jensen. I think he just got a camp invite. I don't think he was actually signed. That's kind of like the latest that seems to be coming out. But ultimately, I like Brock Jensen out of North Dakota State. He was the quarterback on Billy Turner's team. career record of 47-5. Ended up passing for a school record 2,800 yards and 34 touchdowns this past season. And when you watch him, you know, he reminds me of Alex Smith. He struggles with the deep ball. He's kind of inconsistent right now when facing pressure, but as far as like where he can become, you know, strong at is a backup quarterback role because he has good short to intermediate accuracy. He has fairly good vision, pretty good mobility in the pocket. And you look at the Dolphins roster, and Matt Moore is going to be gone after the season. You know, his price tag is ridiculously high, and Pat Devlin, you know, the pet for Joe Philbin, I think he's going to be really challenged by Brock Jensen this training camp. So I could definitely see him making the roster. And then I think the most interesting guy that they added was Anthony Johnson, the defensive tackle out of LSU. We all know his abilities as far as, you know, athletic, what he can do. He was considered by some a potential first-round pick entering 2013. Really struggled with consistency and motor throughout the season, which seems to kind of be an MO for some LSU players. So I think this is a guy with upside. He failed the drug test at the combine, leading to him being, you know, undrafted amongst his in-season struggles. But Johnson's a guy, even on a deep Dolphins roster, especially at defensive line, I think he could actually surprise people. And if he's focused, I wouldn't be surprised if he's on the opening day roster. I'll let you guys kind of address some of the other ones. But those are my two, you know, the bigger name guys that I thought were interesting signings.
Or maybe if Kyle, you want to go through some guys you saw at the East-West Shrine game. I know there was a couple, like Tariq Edwards, I think, linebacker from Virginia Tech. He was at the East-West Shrine game. I don't know if there are any other players that kind of took your eye there, or you can kind of see having a role.
Edwards didn't really pop for me, but there were two guys at the Shrine game that did pop. One of which was Darrell Johnson, the linebacker from East Carolina. He's pretty quick to the football. You know, he's got good football instincts. He's short, compact, heavy hitter, tackles fairly well, and loves to get downhill. I think that's something that, you know, as a special teams potential player and a depth player, I think he has the potential to stick on the roster just because he's got good instincts and he's balls to the wall. You know, he is not afraid to hit. Garrison Smith, the defensive tackle out of Georgia Tech, is another guy that was at the Shrine game that, you know, if Anthony Johnson doesn't have his head on straight, Garrison Smith can potentially challenge for a backup role in that 4-3 one-tech position where you're not quite relied on so much for penetration and disruption skills as you are, you know, just trying to occupy blockers and take up space and have a strong anchor so you're not getting thrown off the line of scrimmage. Smith is a guy that is very thick. I think he's fairly athletic. So I think he's a guy that could potentially challenge for a spot depending on what the more talented players like Anthony Johnson do. And just the one other name that I want to throw out quick that was not at the Shrine game was Tyler Larson, the offensive lineman from Utah State. I thought he was one of the better overall centers in the class. I was really surprised to see him fall, totally undrafted. I thought he was better than Brian Stewart, who the Patriots took. He's fairly strong at the point of attack. He's very smart. He's active in pass protection and finding things to do. A lot of times as a center, you know, they don't have anybody over the top of them, so they struggle staying active and participating. You know, they sometimes just kind of get lost in space and float. Larson's a guy that will go out of his way to hit people. Short arms, but at the same time, you know, when he gets his hands on, he does a pretty good job controlling. So I think he's a guy that, as a depth interior offensive lineman, also has potential to stick on the roster.
I'll chip in with a couple more. I think Gator Hoskins was one guy I really liked. I watched a lot of him and Garrett Scott. So I've watched quite a lot of Marshall over the past couple of months, and he's basically a Charles Clay clone. That's kind of like how he projects. So I think that could be an interesting pair as kind of using in preseason to get the same looks and test out formations, and whether that maybe they have two hybrid fullbacks on the roster. I think he's a really talented player. He had great production in college. I think last year he had the most touchdowns for a tight end in college football, and the year before he had the second most behind Fourier. So he's a productive player. He's pretty much the only weapon for Marshall as well. So when kind of a player is that's so highly schemed against and still productive, that's generally a good sign for lower level players. So I think he's going to a good situation for him where they already have a similar player, so they know kind of how to utilize him, find space for him to thrive in. Another player I think who's interesting, who's only going down the road, is Trevor Mims, the edge rusher from Florida. He's obviously the other side of Lynch, who's more kind of acclaimed player, but he has nice length. I think he bends well. He's another project kind of edge rusher. I could see him potentially making the practice squad as a player they want to groom to be a fourth or fifth edge rusher, depending on how many they want to have on the roster. But I think he flashes some interesting traits. Obviously, he didn't dominate competition. I think he had 3 or 4 sacks last year, so that generally doesn't project well. But he was destructive, and I think he has some traits that project. And the last guy I bring up is Ryan Lankford, the Illinois wide receiver. I think he had some special teams kind of skills that kind of are lacking with Thigpen, so maybe he competes for that. I think that's going to be kind of a very interesting battle to watch, is kind of who wins that returner position and whether they have a role on the offense as well, or defense if it's a corner. But those are kind of the gut, and maybe we'll bring up a couple of bad ones. Dion Blue, who's just god awful, and I mean, Alabama corners are generally pretty bad because they can't backpedal, let alone one that's not flexible or can run. So just because he's from Alabama, he'll be quite an interesting kind of story, as one of the big school guys is going to be worse than all of the small school guys that he drafted. So maybe that's why he was brought on, just to show, look, these guys from Alabama are awful. We need to go to the small school guys. That's where they're all good. So maybe hopefully that's Hickey's viewpoint, because they battled the Bills quite heavily for him. So that's the one guy I wouldn't hold your breath for. And then, are there any kind of players you're surprised that dropped out to the out of the draft and you thought they were steals? I think a couple of teams did really well. I think the Ravens did really well, and Oakland, personally. I think they kind of got 3 or 4 players that could, or 2 or 3 that could even be starters for the Bills with for the Ravens with Avery Patterson. I think he could be this starting safety. They did list him as a corner, which is interesting. So, but any other players you kind of were surprised went undrafted?
I was surprised to see 2 guys drop out. Actually 3. James Gale, the defensive end out of Virginia Tech, and he actually came out after the draft and said that he tore his labrum during the season and played the entire season with the torn labrum, did not miss a snap for it, and that torn labrum was the reason why he did not get drafted. He has since agreed to terms with the Tennessee Titans. I had Gale inside my top 50. I thought he was an outstanding player, just not quite flexible enough to bend on the edge. I think he will offer very similar value in their new 3-4 scheme as Derek Morgan, the defensive end out of Georgia Tech that got taken in the first round a couple years ago. They're similar players. I think they will both be very solid rotational, strong side outside linebackers in that 3-4, where they're not relied on necessarily to be that pressure player on a consistent basis. Rashad Reynolds, the corner out of Oregon State, smaller kid. Saw him at the Shrine game. Loved his ball skills. He's a gamer. I'm not sure. I haven't heard anything on the medicals from him. But you have to figure at least something was off for him to fall that far. He can't be that talented with his ball skills and just not get drafted because he's small. I was really surprised to see him. He was actually 37th on my board. I was very high on him. And Shane Scove out of Stanford. I know he ran slow, ran into 5.2s, put it off as late as he possibly could. He didn't run until, I think, April 17th or something like that, and still struggled to break 5.2 with his 40. But his football instincts are so good. And for him to go to the San Francisco 49ers and play with Coach Harbaugh again, I think he is going to be an absolute steal. I think he no doubt makes the roster. I think he'll be a contributor very early on with their inside linebacker situation. Him in a 3-4 is a perfect fit for a downhill thumper.
Yeah, I definitely agree with those names, especially Rashad Reynolds. I mean, he was an extraordinarily effective player for Oregon State. I mean, the way he matched up against Brandon Cooks, you know, or I'm sorry, not Brandon Cooks, Josh Huff, sorry, for Oregon. And, I mean, you could just tell this is an NFL player, and he might be relegated to the slot after playing, mostly on the outside in his career. But, I mean, everything that he does is just solid. He's got great quickness, good ball skills, plays the boundary well, even though, look at his size, he might not play there in the NFL. Everything should translate to being a solid nickelback, and I'm wondering if he's going to be the next. Interesting to kind of see if anything comes out as far as his medicals, because that was really a shocking drop for him. Definitely with you on Jackson Jeffcoat. James Gale. I would also point out Jackson Jeffcoat, like you said, and then Christian Jones out of Florida State. He doesn't really have a true position, moved from linebacker to defensive end, and it didn't really have a true position at Florida State. And then you try to project him in the NFL, and you're definitely saying the same thing. I mean, if he didn't have a true position in college. So he's just an athlete that Chicago picked up. You're going to try to develop his instincts a little bit more, try to beef him up a little bit. But overall, a talented athlete that was kind of surprising. I'm not going to say shocked, but kind of surprised that he went undrafted. And then a guy I was actually really surprised went undrafted was Deion Bailey out of USC, signed with the Seattle Seahawks. Just a very effective safety. You look at what he did in 2013. He was limited to a specific role until the Fresno State game. As soon as Fresno State game came around, they unleashed him. They used him in a much different role than they did the rest of the season, and he excelled in it. So in my write-up of him, I ended up saying, I think this is a guy that you put him in a specific role, he's going to star for you, and maybe not be, Earl Thomas good, but he can definitely, I think he can start for most teams in a specified role, keeping his responsibilities, fairly limited as he develops his, the rest of his game. But it just kind of speaks to the depth of this class. I mean, you can look at the top undrafted free agent list, and you can say, these are guys that are getting drafted day 3 most other seasons.
We had Tiny Richardson, 2 of the Florida corners who were all kind of highly touted even in the top 2 days, and obviously they have, and Victor Hampton, they all have kind of character or health concerns we've kind of found out. Zachary Kerr, I thought, was an interesting player to fall. I really liked him. He's like a disruptive one-tech. He kind of has that pedigree coming from Georgia, and they obviously kind of all kind of disappeared. But I thought he was a really interesting player. I was jumping on the table wanting the Dolphins to pick him for probably the last 3 rounds of the draft. But clearly there's teams know something we don't, and I think that's kind of one thing I always try and stress is we can only really judge what's on the field and what's kind of levelly out there for all the prospects. We don't get to meet them and talk to them, or often in person, or really get to examine who these people are or get medical reports on everyone. So we have a small base to go off, and we're kind of looking at what they do on a football field. But there's a lot of talent in this class, and I think it was interesting. It was a really interesting draft compared to where some players went, like Justin Britt, and he went really high, and I mean that was crazy. And then No, not good. But I think it was a good. I think it was a really interesting draft. A lot of players I really liked. Like I was happy Garrett Scott found a home. He'll probably beat out Justin Britt anyway, the Seahawks. So he'll have a ring soon. So that's good. I did a vault me that he'll be the best left tackle from this class in 5 years. So that should happen in the Seahawks. Watch out for that. But are there any last thoughts you want to kind of make? I think we've answered all the questions that came up. So is there kind of like any last thoughts you want to have, or maybe any prospects for 2015 to look forward to?
God.
Yeah,
I'm not bringing up the 2015 just yet. I'm going to give myself about a week or two to breathe.
It's going to be a great tackle class. Some really good guys. If Andre comes out, it's going to be insane.
Yeah, but Garrett Scott already came out, though.
Yeah, I mean, the tackle class is going to be really good. There's like, Garrett Scott, yeah, but there'll be another Garrett Scott. Marshall line now. Whoever's the guy behind Garrett Scott is going to be real good.
It's setting up to be a good class next year. I mean, I'm not going to jump into 2015 until a little bit. I'm actually going to try to develop my own scouting guide, kind of like Kyle did. This year he was super impressive with what he accomplished, and I'm not doing it just because Kyle did. I'm not trying to be a copycat at all or anything like that. But I kind of aspire to do the same thing, and so I think I'm going to try to work on like the layout and the aesthetic version of that before I really jump into 2015, because ultimately, I mean, it's cool to look at prospects this early and stuff, but you have to be careful with that too, because I think what is important to remember is look at the same hype that a year ago that Anthony Barr was getting. I mean, I went on Twitter about, I don't know, probably about 11 months ago from today, and I didn't bash Anthony Barr, and I've never really been low on him really, but I just kind of expressed some concerns about I didn't think he's really the fantastic athlete that, let's say Deion Jordan, in my opinion, is. And people really got super defensive about it. And regular season came around, and all of a sudden, well, it ended up being that way. Like, the public perception changed because expectations got kind of out of whack. And I think it's just important to remember that young players don't always get better just because they're young. I mean, they get better because of other reasons. So it's going to be a super deep edge rusher class next year. Quarterback's probably going to be a decent class with maybe 1 or 2 stars. Just trying to think. I mean, I think wide receiver is going to be another deep draft, and that's just going to continue to be a deep class every year. And defensive backs are actually going to be a much stronger class in terms of star power at the top than it was this year. They definitely have a clear-cut number 1 safety, in my opinion, with Landon Collins next year. And then my number 1 corner entering next year is Ifo Olumo from Oregon. So just kind of entering the year, those are like my initial thoughts, but I'm going to try to take it easy for like the next month and just kind of shift back to NFL a little bit.
Well, yeah, I'm not going to be like as professional as you two with grades and stuff. I just drink and watch football. But I look at kind of prospects whilst I kind of watch a whole game and write notes and everyone. So I kind of already have a handle on like the next class. That's kind of like the way I work, and then I do my second look on the past year's tape, so I don't really need to go relive it. I think that this cornerback class is going to be really interesting, especially in the Pac-12. There's a couple of guys like Josh Shaw is really nice, and the Oregon State kid Stephen Nelson, he is really good. So I think Pac-12 is loaded next year, and I wouldn't be surprised if someone from there go and take the national championship. That's going to be my hot tip. But I have Pac-12 bias, so for some reason, even though they play the latest games, and that's the most inconvenient for me, so that's a pretty horrible bias to have. Well, I guess we'll end that now. I recommend, even though the draft's over, going and buying Kyle's draft guide. It was only like $10, and I mean, it's well worth it, even if you kind of want to. It's good to kind of like, even for fantasy value, if you like looking at players you want to target and specific schemes they fit in, or just kind of like how the players we've taken on or going forward into future free agencies, kind of seeing where they progress through. It's always good to have kind of other people in sports, and as time goes on, it gets harder and harder to find kind of people's opinions on players that don't get altered by what's happened since. So I think that's always kind of an interesting thing. I think people now look at, say, the Richard Shermans and say, oh, wasn't that a steal, without remembering what he came out as. He didn't come out as a stud corner. He came out as a weird athletic player that was a wide receiver. But now he's just saying, oh, that was a steal, all the teams are stupid. No, there was reasons that he went to that place. So I highly recommend buying that, and obviously buy Ian's in a year's time. So if either of you have any last thoughts, or should we bugger off?
It was a fun draft, and hopefully next year is even better. I think we kind of wrapped it up pretty good.
Well, are you going to be doing kind of anything like with the new class thing, Kyle? Is there anything you're going to have coming up before the college season starts?
Yeah, one of the things that I've started doing is a visual film study, where I'll take a couple of players and I'll do some screenshots, and I'll actually draw some X's and O's and highlight some technique flaws and some technique pros that prospects illustrate functionally throughout the game. I started doing it about a month ago after I finished publication for the draft guide, and I had a couple weeks where I was just kind of sitting on some time and wanted to stay active, so that was one thing that I've done, and I plan on continuing to do that on a weekly basis, and just trying to illustrate some of the fundamentals that people might miss. That's one of the things that I really pride myself on feeling like I have a strong grasp on, is the fundamental and technique side of the game. So I like to highlight those things and try and spread some of that to those who may just kind of look for players that pop with big plays. But other than that, I just want to thank you guys for having me on. It's been nice talking about the Dolphins draft class, and it's been, as Ian said, an outstanding draft season, and here's hoping they don't push next year's back another couple weeks.
Please, for the love of God, do not do that.
Right, well, I guess that'll end it. We'll have some more stuff on the site, kind of more in-depth kind of scheme fit about the players and kind of how we project the roles of players going forward, and as camp kind of shakes out in preseason, maybe we'll do some more hangouts and talk about stuff that isn't social media based, and about what Omar thinks. So I guess.
God, Omar Kelly.
Thanks, Kyle, and thanks to anyone that watched.